Hey everyone, it's Mojaxx back in the DJcity UK lab today with our third episode on live video streaming your DJ sets. Check out the first two if you haven't seen those already. We covered the basics, then we covered doing fancy visual stuff with OBS Studio. Now today we are just talking about audio. This is, of course, as a DJ, really important. You want great sounding audio and you want it to be synchronized with the video. There's nothing worse than watching a stream and you hear something happening and then half a second or a second later the DJ's hand movements match what you just heard a second ago. So it's really important to try and get that locked in. Now it's really hard to do actually because different things happening with your computer, the amount of power it's taking, the amount of horsepower that it's requiring, the stream itself could be dropping back and forth, but you want to get it as tight as possible. And so this is the main setting you need to think about in OBS. Whatever you've got running as your audio input, you need to click the gear icon where it says mixer, and sync offset in milliseconds is what you want to deal with. Now, on some setups, on some tests that I've done, I've had to go right up to like 5,000 milliseconds, which is loads, right? That's a really long time, but that's what it took to really get it perfectly on and synchronized together. You will have to play with that. This is one of those things where I can't give you a definitive, you must use this amount. Every system, every stream will be different. You need to experiment with it. One thing to bear in mind, when you do change that, it will cut the audio out while it resynchronizes again. So ideally do a test stream before your big event or whatever and change the sync offset around until you've got it nailed for that particular time of day, that particular connection that you're on, that particular setup you're running. But that's the one you need to deal with, sync offset, and you can do that in minus values as well if it's going the other way, but generally the audio is the one that's ahead, so you want to delay the audio a little bit, and that should line it up with the video nicely. So I want to get into using external audio interfaces with OBS Studio. From my point of view, this is generally my preferred setup. I'd rather have a USB audio interface running if I can because it gives you lower latency and a guarantee of high quality. Running a line input into your computer's built-in sound card does work. The quality is good enough for streaming, but I find the latency is harder to deal with. Syncing up that audio and video is a bit trickier with a regular line input. And also a lot of recent computers just don't have a line input. For example, most MacBooks, MacBook Pros or whatever made in the last few years just don't have a line input. So you're gonna have to use an external interface, be that USB or Firewire or Thunderbolt, whatever it is you have around. Obviously you don't wanna be spending a lot of money that you don't need to on this project. We want it to be as affordable as possible. But there's one restriction with OBS which is worth kind of noting, and it's why I've got the whiteboard out for the first time ever in the series. I just want to give you a really basic visualization of the kind of issue that we might have with this. OBS will see pretty much any audio interface that will work with your computer will work with OBS, but it will only ever see channels 1 and 2, or left and right, the main channels from any device. So 1 and 2, it's got to be expecting those. So we've got 1 and 2 there, and it cannot receive from anything else. So for example, here in the lab we have the Rain 64 mixer. Fantastic mixer, perfect for this kind of setup because it has 2 USB ports. So one USB port can be running the Serato DJ machine, the other USB port can be running into the streaming machine and feeding audio into OBS. Perfect, you would think, except the Rain 64 has 6 stereo pairs that it could potentially feed into OBS. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 discrete channels altogether. And the record output for the Rain 64 is over here on number 6. And there is no way using the default, setup in Mac or Windows to change that and get number 6 into 1 and 2. You can't do it with the Rain 64 hardware out of the box. That is just a non-starter. The only one that you can feed in there is channels 1 and 2, the first stereo pair. That'll work, but that is the input for deck 3. It's not the overall output. So as you can see, if you don't have some flexible ways of working around this with some hardware that you already own, you might run into trouble. There are some solutions that I'm going to offer you now. So let's take a look at some examples of some hardware setups and some workarounds to kind of fix this problem. So let's use this Rain 64 as an example of a way that we can get around this 2-channel restriction, 1 and 2 only, in OBS, but we're going to do it in a hardware kind of way. We're going to use software, but we're using hardware, a cable, to get around the problem. And this will apply to a bunch of other mixers as well. Straight away, I'm thinking of like the Zone 43C from Allen and Heath, for example. This would be a perfect candidate for that. Basically, we've got 4 channels to play with here. I'm only going to be using 2 on Serato DJ over on this laptop over here. So that one, USB-B, that's all running fine. Serato DJ doing its thing with the mixer, nothing to worry about there. Over here on USB-A, we are running into OBS. And of course, channels 1 and 2 are the only ones that it will see. And channels 1 and 2 on this Range 64 is actually deck 3. So what we can do is basically feed our session output from here. So we plug that in physically on the back of the mixer. Session output, that's taking everything that's coming through the mixer, and we're going to feed that to the line input on deck 3, which is channels 1 and 2. So there's a couple of things you've got to bear in mind. Of course, you can't then turn that channel up in any way. You'll get a massive feedback loop going through the mixer, everything feeding back in on itself, and it will not be a good sound for your listeners. You've got to make sure that that channel is either switched to something else or off. But that's going to work pretty nicely. We go into the system preferences and the Rain 64 control panel, and we'll go into the deck inputs, and we'll just make sure that is set to phono or CD3, not post. If you go post fader, it won't work because of course you're not feeding it in post fader. You need that input signal running in there, and that should do the trick. So now that is basically feeding the session output into channels 1 and 2 on this Range 64. And as we can see, when I do anything with the mixer, playing off Serato DJ over there, the VU goes up and down because we're just feeding in and out. And again, you just got to be really careful. Don't turn that channel fader up. Don't have that channel live, but the rest of the mixer you can use as you wish. And that will just feed in there. So that's a physical workaround. We can physically route an audio cable from the output to inputs 1 and 2, which is the ones that OBS needs. So that's a pretty simple workaround. So that kind of hardware style hack can work really well if you have a lot of channels to spare and if the correct channels work out for you in terms of the layout and the decks that you use and so on, then that's going to work well. So 64 and a few other mixers, that's going to work fine. But not for everything. Like for example, the Range 62 has a similar kind of setup to the 64, but doesn't have the extra channels to work with. So there's no way you can route into channels 1 and 2. It's just not going to happen in a physical sense. So I looked at software options, and you can do aggregate devices in OS X. You can set them up, but there's no way to assign different channels to different things. So I came across this application called Loopback, and this is from Rogue Amoeba, who make Audio Hijack and applications like that. It's basically based on Soundflower, which a lot of OS X users will be familiar with. That was a kind of a virtual audio device that let you do all kinds of stuff in terms of routing, but that is now a dead project and it doesn't work with current versions of OS X very well. So this is Rogue Amoeba's, they've forked it, they've taken it on and expanded upon it, its functionality, given it a nice interface and so on. And let's give you an idea of how this is going to work. So we're going to create a virtual audio device. So I'm going to call this one 64 Tweak. And we are going to add a new source. We're going to add in the 64. You can have multiple sources in one if you want to. So there is our Range 64. And we're going to go to channel mapping, manual. And there we can see we've got all our available input channels from the mixer into the computer. And we are going to add them to left and right for the output. So in this case, 11 and 12 is the record output of the mixer. I'm going to drag that to left and right. And that now is perfect. That will do the trick. We can go in and add that in OBS Studio. So we can go in, we can set that as our main device, 64 Tweak. And we can see we've got level coming into it there. And then we can go into OBS and we can add that in as our sound source. Job done. So as you can see in this situation, Loopback really is a superb bit of kit. It does the business really well. It's not cheap, right? It's $99 US, and that is quite a big investment for any bit of software. But from my point of view, there are so many situations where I can see it coming in handy outside of the live streaming thing that for me, the investment is absolutely worth it. Now, if you are on Windows, there is no version of Loopback for Windows, but there is an app called Virtual Audio Cable. Now, I'd be really intrigued to hear if any of you have tried that. Please let us know in the comments if that will do a similar kind of thing for Windows. I hope it does, because actually having that functionality available to you is very valuable for this kind of setup. Now, the good news is if you're a Pioneer DJM S9 owner, that actually just kind of works out the box. You don't have to mess around. You need to go into the setting utility, change the aux to record output, and that is actually channels 1 and 2. It doesn't look like it in the utility software. It looks like it's, you know, 5 and 6, but in fact, no, that is channels 1 and 2. It's very straightforward. One thing to note with the S9, you will need to use USB-A in order to run the record output. That will only work on the first computer. So if you're running Serato DJ on a second computer, do that one on USB-B. The DJM S9 recording that you're feeding to OBS Studio, that will be on USB-A. But then really, it's as simple as you like. Now, one piece of hardware which I haven't got here in the lab to demonstrate, but I have actually set up with OBS Studio, is the DJM 900 Nexus from Pioneer DJ. That one, you can just go into the setting utility, you can set the record output over to channel 1, so you're sacrificing channel 1, but then, yeah, the whole mixer is just outputting to channels 1 and 2, and that feeds directly into OBS without any problems. So we'll look at some standalone interfaces and how they will work with it as well. Now, of course, bear in mind that I do still wholeheartedly recommend you have 2 computers, one for DJing and one for your streaming. So I wouldn't recommend really using these on the same machine at the same time. But yeah, the Audio 10 from Native Instruments, this one has main channels 1 and 2, left and right, are on line level RCA inputs. So you can totally run your output from your mixer into the inputs, main, in and out, and that will feed into OBS just fine. Likewise with the SL3, it's got a line level input on the aux, and that is channel 1 and 2, you can feed into there. You could do it on the same computer if you wanted to. You could feed your mixer in there and OBS will see this. I wouldn't recommend it though. Really, still would not recommend running both things, you know, streaming and DJing on the same machine. Now, so far, everything we've really talked about has been dependent on you having some hardware already. So a mixer with 2 USB ports, or an interface with 2 USB ports, or a spare audio interface. What if you don't have any of those things? What if you just have a mixer with 1 USB or no USBs? What are you going to do to get that signal into your system over USB? Well, this is the one that I'm going to recommend, the Behringer UCA202 interface. It's very simple, RCA connectors, 1 line input, 1 line output. That's it. USB cable on the end, and I've tested this with OBS Studio. It works a treat. Street price, $30 to $40. Low latency, good quality. It couldn't get much simpler than this, but it couldn't get more effective than this really as well. You just connect it up, it presents channels 1 and 2 to OBS, no issues with routing, and that's it. Very affordable, nice, simple. This is a great device for this purpose. So there you go, we look at some of the ways of getting high quality, low latency audio into your OBS setup, whether or not you have a line level input on your built-in sound card on your computer. I know this one was kind of complicated. Some of this stuff is pretty hard to explain, but I hope it kind of makes sense for you. In the end, if you're having too much trouble with your existing hardware that you own, just go out and buy something like this, the Behringer UCA202, $30 to $40. Simple but effective, does the trick very nicely and will work for those MacBook Pros in particular with no line input. This is all you need really. Just get one of these, plug in, and off you go. Now, this is the 3rd episode of 4 in this series. Now, the 4th one will have to wait. I've done 2 and 3 very quickly. I didn't intend to, but you guys and girls wanted this information. But the 4th one will have to wait because it's about recommending different streaming services to you, the strengths and weaknesses of those. And I can't recommend anything until I've really tested it. So I'm going to need to do a lot of streaming over the next few weeks to actually come to a conclusion about which platforms are the best ones for you to choose. So look out for that one in a few weeks' time. And in the meantime, make sure you are subscribed for all our future tips, tricks, and product reviews. I'll see you soon.